Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First and most important question, can you hear me?
Yes.
I see some nodding, so this is already a good start. Well, apparently in the last row, not fully. Okay. Well, let me welcome you to our session on democracy and governance. This today is the third day of our R&I days we organized for the first time. And with our new program, we have entered into a new way of creating legislation and of creating a program. Namely, what we want to do is co-creation. We do away with silos and we want to work together. The reason for it is that the challenges we're faced with today are so big that not one single discipline or one single service can resolve it. This co-creation has also produced some challenges for us. Just to give you one example, in the Commission services, it's very important who is in the lead of something. And of course, if you're in the lead, you don't want the others to be too much involved into your things because it's yours. So it took us some time to really understand and to work that this is something we all need to do together. It took us some time, but I think we've now arrived at the stage where we all can support what we have produced so far. And we're now in the second stage that we want to involve our stakeholders, our citizens, the universities, the researchers, their organizations. To this end, we've launched our open public consultation at the end of June, which will go on until 4th of October, so you can still submit your proposals. And through this, we will produce our strategic outline for the next 4 years. That is to say, within the legally set framework, how to approach this best with the experience and with the requests from our citizens and from our stakeholders. Now, the R&I days we organize for the first time this year. With this, we have entered uncharted waters because it's for the first time that we organize such a big event. I think we've got more than 4,000 persons here in these rooms. And as it is for the first time, we also from time to time need to improvise because we need to cope with the unexpected. On the other hand, I think this is a real life situation. And when I'm speaking of a real life situation, let me just mention a few things. Wolfgang Merkel, who should be our first speaker here, he has just landed with his plane because his plane got late, so we don't know if he will make it to our session. You also see some empty seats. There are two reasons for that. One is that with the metro, some of you might have experienced this morning, there are considerable delays. And I was also informed that on our app, our session was mentioned for 10 o'clock. So, which of course is unfortunate, but let's take it from a positive angle. With this, we are fewer people and can have a more in-depth discussion. Having said this, our goal this morning is not to lecture you, but we want to listen to you. And our speakers this morning do have the challenge to do a pitch to foster your comments and your input. And with this, I ask my co-chairman, Matthias Reiter-Paswandi, to make his first statement. Matthias works for the Austrian Ministry of Education and Research, and he's also the Austrian member of our program committee for our Societal Challenge 6, and I would be surprised if you were not the representative in the new program in our new cluster, what we call cluster number 2 in our jargon. Matthias, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Harald. So exactly, my role as a program delegate in the current program committee is the one that brings me here today, and with the wisdom of our hierarchy, I will also be the delegate in Horizon Europe. That's true. What I want to say now to set this in the right, so to set the scene is the role of research in the next cluster on inclusive society. What kind of research we are expecting to be funded there. The relation of cluster 2, inclusive societies, and the other clusters in Horizon Europe. I think this is really important, and this is also the value of this event, that you have all disciplines, all different research fields in these 3 days in this big event. Then a few words about the process, but basically you said already how it works. And then we all know what we can expect. So the cluster 2 in this second pillar of Horizon Europe should fund applied research and innovation. And we know that many of the interesting research questions in this field tend towards basic research. So there is some, as you know, the first pillar, the European Research Council. And I think this is really important to find the right balance here, to also have research results that can be used by policymakers, that can be used by citizens, by non-governmental organizations, that can be used in everyday life, in real life. And I think this is the challenge here for the projects. The second thing is, and this relates directly to the legal document also of the next program, that it should be European research, that it should be research that will not be funded on a national level. And usually this brings in a comparative perspective. Many member states joining together in large research consortia and bringing the view of very different member states, different regions together in one project. And this is to a certain level self-explaining, but I think it's still important that this is the real added value of the research that will be funded here. One last relation I would like to point out within the program is to the research infrastructures. There are huge research infrastructures that collect data that are funded by the Commission and member states and that are very relevant for democracy research. One is the European Social Survey, but there are others out there like Ingrid, a research infrastructure on inequality. There is SHARE that is more going towards pension policies and social policy. And there is a consortia forming and finding itself at the moment that is called Monitoring Electoral Democracy. And it's really bringing together all the data when it comes to voter surveys, when it comes to the quantitative analysis of political programs. So I think this is another part of the program of Horizon Europe that relations should be made. And we will discuss together with you more about democracy research and issues related to climate change, to artificial intelligence. And I just want to say that there are other parts in Horizon Europe that have a real focus there. And I think we should also think together and discuss together how this future part of the program, this cluster 2, can be a hub to link also to other parts of the program and to bring expertise that is built up here to other research fields. And I think yesterday's sessions have really shown that other sciences and research fields ask for social sciences and humanities expertise, but we also have to bring it to them. So it's a two-way project, so to say.
Yeah.
And with this, I hand over to
Heather.
I'm Heather Graby from the Open Society European Policy Institute. I have a background both in research, academic research, and in policy. I was in the European Commission for 5 years. And I'd like to pose a question to you about how to gain and sustain democratic consent for the enormous climate transition that's just starting now. And I ask this both because I think research and civil society and the connection between them are vital to do this. And so my question is related to how do we do that? Now, climate change is like the oxygen that we breathe. It's going to be in everything from now on because we're now becoming aware of the urgency of action. But it's also incredibly complicated and it's not obvious what to do. This is not, in democratic terms, a simple question you can put to a referendum. In fact, there are very few simple questions you can put to a referendum, I would argue. But also, it's something where the 19th century infrastructure for representative democracy that we have of political parties and parliaments and so on is quite ill-suited, both to extremely rapid action and sustained measures over time. And in the case of climate change, you have a very strong dimension that democratic consent depends on the transition being effective and also being fair. If it seems to be either not achieving its goals and not actually reducing global warming and all of the other terrible impacts that we're seeing, and if it's seen as putting the burden of adjustment unfairly on particular parts of society, for example, consumers and households, then that transition is not going to happen unless you get rid of democracy. Some people say that's what you do. You should actually have a state-controlled, top-down solution, impose it on society, use the Chinese model, and forget about democracy. My question to you is, how can we go the other way? How can you have very deep democratic engagement on this with an evidence base? And that's the key thing, because sequencing of climate action, the sequencing of the policy measures and the funding that need to be put in place to make it happen is not obvious. It's something that needs a strong evidence base. Research is really needed to see what order do you do things in. Is it emissions trading first and then a carbon adjustment tax? Or is it changing the whole tax system to bring in the real price of the environmental externalities of production? And to use that science properly, and use the research in the democratic debate, you need a very different kind of engagement with voters, I would argue. So how can this be brought to civil society and to engage with civil society? Is it possible to have some kind of evidence-based civil society engagement where there's a deep democratic engagement on these issues, which has a real impact on policy? How would you do that? What would be the effective mechanisms that you know of in your own sphere of influence in the area that you work in? What kind of research needs to go to the people so that climate change is really understood? Not just the research about the degrees of potential global warming, rising sea levels and so on, but also what are effective measures and how to finance it. What kind of research would you use? How would you make it accessible? And how would you design a democratic engagement where civil society can be fully involved to ensure it can be sustained over the next decades?
Thanks. Yeah. So thanks very much, Heather. I think you've really posed a very complex challenge. On the other hand, this is a real life situation where we need to see how the individual citizens can contribute to something of a global scale. Because you could say, well, what can my vote, my voice make? Can it make a difference? The answer might be no, but there are ways with which you can succeed. And there we would be very happy to get your feedback, your ideas, because this will help us to steer the research in democracy for the next 4 years. The floor is open.
Bit too big a challenge for first thing in the morning. On the third day.
Yes, please. Okay. Okay, so... Yeah. We owe you a coffee for the first question.
It's simply, thank you very much, Heather. That's a very, very important point. Evidence-based research is so necessary.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Might be better with the microphone, of course.
Right. I say thank you very much, Heather, and for a very, very important question. Evidence-based science also requires trust,
in expertise. Now, you can have science that says both ways. If you take climate change, you could very easily find people that say it doesn't exist. I won't mention any names. So I think further back, we have to tackle that problem, is trust in evidence.
Thank you. Who would be next? Yeah, please, last row, and then you.
My name is Maria from the Swedish Research Council. I wanted to go back to what you said about how the uneven burden, and I think it's perhaps difficult to stimulate research in that, but I think what is needed is also a systemic change, because otherwise civil society citizens will feel that the burden is uneven. You can't put everything in the hands of individuals. So if we could address that kind of, I mean, how evidence is so massive, so why don't things happen? I mean, what do we need to get systemic change, institutional change? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Nick Brunsveld from the University of Amsterdam. In the area where I live in the Netherlands, wind turbines are being set up, and research shows that people are more willing to have them in their area if they benefit from them somehow, financially, or that might be a way of doing this. But that also, to me, poses a question. What if we can't work out any way for people to benefit from the actions that we need to take? Won't we be making it harder for us to implement those changes? If we put them in this sort of economic scheme of benefiting from the changes that we're making. Thank you.
Okay. Next, please. Yes, please. Jorgos, here on the right.
Hi, Anthony from Democratic Society. I think one of the things that strikes me about the research need here is that we have a lot of parallel projects that are going on. You know, it's like at the moment I run an organisation that does these sorts of democratic participation exercises. And it's a bit like that scene in Harry Potter with all the letters. You know, suddenly everyone is looking for citizens' assemblies on climate change, something in Scotland, something in France, and all of these sorts of things. To do that well, I think we need to be backed by research that puts some of the basics in place. Because we're a small organisation, but we're quite big in our sector with like 20 people. So we need to have the research agenda for the European Commission pushing into some of the methods, some of the kind of the deeper learning, thinking about how digital and how AI can be used to support the kind of events that we do, and really try to structure that kind of space that's being created between governments and citizens. So in a way, I'd argue it's more like the kind of GSM for democracy that we need. We need the fundamental underlying infrastructure on which people can build all sorts of new initiatives. And we need to get away from funding initiatives, because that just feels like the shift we're in, moving from projects into a systemic change.
Thank you. Then maybe we could... Sorry, yeah. I didn't see the gentleman, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. My name is Shreyas, and I work with a science communication tech startup in London. I wonder whether we can take some inspiration from the change in the way health policy has been done in the last sort of 20 years or so, where we've gone from essentially trying to educate and engage with the medical profession to putting the patient at the center of, it seems very obvious in retrospect, putting the patient at the center of health policy making. And one of the kind of key barriers around that is actually the patient's ability to, given all of the other things that they're doing in their lives and maybe a lack of scientific training, be exposed to the evidence in a way that they can understand it and engage with it, essentially. And I think one of the challenges, and perhaps this exercise as a whole, as a co-design session, is a representative of that, is how do we bring that evidence base to society at large, and maybe use new technology to enable us to do that. Do we feel that the co-design process that the Commission is going through is reaching citizens? Are citizens able to contribute to influencing the outcomes of the Horizon Europe strategic plan? And if we don't think so, then surely there's an exercise in demonstrating that kind of new model of governance and participative democracy is possible through this exercise itself. So I do wonder whether there's any thoughts from the panel on whether that health approach is working, and whether we can demonstrate some of these things through the activities that we're going through right now.
Yes, please. Tobias.
Hello, I'm Tobias Ström from the Research Council of Norway, previously in DG Research and Innovation, Inclusive Societies. Just picking up a little bit about Matthias' point about the importance of synergies between clusters. And I also, hearing about this climate change as an example, I just want to mention that a lot of the SSH community in Europe has a lot of criticism that there is no SSH mission. But there is one in a way. I mean, climate change and societal transformation, very many people are forgetting about that add-on. And I hope that's going to be more than an add-on. And this thematic discussion shows the relevance of that there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. Next to Tobias, the lady wanted also to take the floor.
Yes. Hello, I'm Åsa Gornicka. I'm Vice President of the University of Oslo. First of all, I'm extremely happy that the framework program will take this thematic seriously. I think, Tobias, we have the addition to the missions, but I think in essence, maybe the threat or the challenge to democracy is one of those that could have been formulated into a mission. I think the challenge for our societies are so enormously linked to how we deal with transformation and adaptation of our democratic institutions. So I hope that the rest of the framework program also will allow us to address these fundamental questions about the role of democratic institutions. And these are institutions that allows us to live together even though we have different interests. And there are some fundamental challenges that I think are some basic megatrends that I think we need to address as researchers on how the institutions and the links between institutions pick up on these megatrends. Of course, climate change, classic wicked issue, doesn't get more wicked than climate change. But also the increasingly digital divide and the impact on the distributional consequences of a digital society. On the same with also, which is somewhat paradoxical, that we have a situation where also the advent of a knowledge society, a knowledge economy, also is a challenge for how we adapt our democratic system. Where some talk about diploma, and our Dutch colleagues talk about the diploma democracy, and an increasing divide between those who have higher education and their ability to participate in a democratic institution and political decision making. So I think there are several challenges here that link the overall megatrends that we experience to the issue of how an insight into how our institutions and how our societies operate in a democratic context. And I think that's also a prerogative of the European Union and of Europe to stand up and be a spearhead in how in research on democratic transformation. So we're really looking forward to how this will be phrased and picked up by the coming framework program. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, maybe before I give the floor to you, Heather, again, there's 3 points I think maybe we could have some additional input. One was the short-term benefit versus the long-term benefits. how can you help people or get their support for long-term benefits, which might be versus short-term benefits? And we've also spoken about evidence and why is evidence not sufficient that it brings about change. And I think this is one of the fundamental questions related to social sciences and humanities, because 80% of our decisions are not being done on the basis of evidence, but they're done on the basis of emotions. And that is one of the reasons why there is a paradox between the decision and between evidence. And how can we overcome this? This is one of the biggest challenges we've got in the European Commission, because we've not yet got one European society, but we've got European societies. They all encode and decode in a different way. And if we do not respect this, then we will have difficulties in getting things across. Are there any comments on these elements before I give the floor back to you, Heather? This does not seem to be clear. Sorry, I have to, yeah, it's a bit difficult to see. Yeah. Is there?
The lady from Norway.
Okay, sorry, yeah. We will have sufficient time for yours as Wolfgang.
Just one comment on this, because I think there are two kind of contrary developments. On the one hand, we see increasingly the expertisation of not only of our democratic institutions and public administration, but also civil society. There is an expertisation of the civil society organizations, and at the same time, you get the counter movement, distrust in science, distrust in evidence, and so on. So I think that's a real puzzle that these two phenomena are operating at the same time.
Thank you very much. Now, Heather, would you be kind enough to briefly respond before I give the floor to Thomas?
So, on the short-term versus long-term benefits, I think this is an absolutely key issue, because you need a different kind of democratic engagement for systemic change than you do for going and asking for a one-off vote. If you're going to change the entire system, it's not enough to have political parties putting forward manifestos of one kind or another just for the next 4 or 5 years. You've got a longer time horizon where you need to have a sustained policy over several elections. You can't chop and change. You can't just, as they put it in Britain, throw the bastards out and have a new government, because you actually need to sustain policy. And I think one of the very good lessons the European Union could learn here, and we could look at as an example, and there's a lot of very interesting research on this, is post-communist transition, which was another kind of systemic change in which there was, in my view, insufficient democratic engagement, and that has come back to bite us because it's meant there was lack of presentation to the public of what the whole thing was going to look like, and there's still a lot of grievance in those countries, even though, in fact, that transition brought higher living standards and better quality of life for pretty well everybody. But a lot of that, there was a huge amount of short-term pain. So let's learn from that method, from that experience, and find better methods of doing it. And I would suggest that the way to look is the 2 points about systemic change and trust are absolutely key here. That if you're going to have a systemic change, you've got to build trust in the public that even if there are short-term detriments, that there's going to be a long-term benefit for them, and that they're actually involved in decision-making about issues in the short term. For example, the wind turbines. So decentralization of decision-making, especially where the economy is decentralized by being decarbonized. So i.e., for example, wind turbines, that's a local community producing electricity locally. So the benefits surely should come in the form of electricity, so that people can see a direct connection between the wind turbine that appears, which they may not be too happy about, and what happens in their daily lives. But also the trust has got to be built up by having a deal. I think the underemphasized part of the European Green Deal is the deal part. It has to be a new social contract where people can see that over time the burden of just a adjustment will be spread fairly. If the EU goes into compensating the losers from the beginning, then it's the short-term losers who will get all the public money, and there will be a lot of rent-seeking going on. And the longer-term losers will not get that because the money will have run out or the transition won't have happened. And that's a huge danger. So we can't just stumble from one European Council to the next. And that's why I think there needs to be this deeper democratic engagement. But how to do it, and the evidence base is key, and that takes me to the second question. Why is evidence insufficient to bring about change and the role of emotions? I think what kind of evidence is absolutely key. There are plenty of kinds of evidence that actually engage people's emotions, and also how it's presented to them. And I think, the experience that Antony Zachaszewski was pointing out about citizens' assemblies, that the kind of evidence that's presented, the way in which it's presented matters enormously. You don't just throw science textbooks and, peer-reviewed articles at people. You've got to present it in an accurate but accessible way, and it's got to be relevant to their daily lives. But how do you do that, and who decides? And this is where we need much better evidence base on best practice, on how that works, bringing in not just the climate scientists on the technical side, but social psychologists who can look at the question of how people influence each other when they look at scientific research. Look at the vaccine movement. The social psychology of what's happened on anti-vax is really interesting. What about, for example, neuroscientists on cognitive bias? Also psychologists and psychoanalysts on how people deal with enormous existential threats, how they process that. Also, I think sociology has a lot to say, too, about how whole societies deal with systemic change. So I think bringing in the evidence base in terms of how to engage with the public is also a key part of this.
Thank you very much, Heather. I think me and my colleagues, we have been writing down like mad all the ideas which have been put forward during this part of the discussion. I think it will really help us in putting together a 4 years vision for our research in that field. And I think this practical example of the climate change brought up very many elements we should really deal with. And this now brings me to our next speaker, Thomas Poel from the University of Amsterdam. And Thomas, you're an expert in the new media and in citizens' participation. And I think what we've heard from the first two speakers directly leads to your subject.
Sure. So thanks all for coming out this morning. I'm really impressed with the feedback which you've given so far. So I can see the purpose of having a co-design session at 9 o'clock in the morning. What I want to bring to the table are basically two large concerns which have come up in my research on digital platforms over the past decade with a couple of colleagues. So what we're working on is how digital platforms from platform corporations, is probably more accurate to say, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, are intervening in key spheres of life and economic sectors. And that, as you all know, brings particular democratic challenges to the table. And I want to highlight two and hear your response on those. I want to close by just pointing into the direction of potential ways for research to engage with these challenges. So the first one, which obviously is familiar to you, is the challenge of transparency. So we currently have a very limited understanding of how information and opinions circulate in a platform environment, as we don't have access to platform data and we don't have insights into how the algorithms that are used to sort this data and these signals from users are processed, curated, and received. So, and that the consequence of that is that, as we've seen over the past years, that makes processes of public opinion formation highly unpredictable and difficult also to govern in a democratic fashion. And this is about much more than simply the circulation of misinformation, which has received a lot of press. It's really about the obfuscation of the basic mechanisms of public debate. So who is accountable for spreading particular ideas and claims? Who is responsible for verifying these ideas? So platforms in all of this are neither, and that's really important, I think, what comes out of our research, are neither editors in the traditional sense of the word, as we know from the mass media, nor host of information without doing any change to what is exchanged. So instead, they shape what is done through their interfaces, algorithms, and moderation practices. And they obviously do so in a largely intransparent fashion. And the intransparency will only increase in years to come as machine learning is increasingly employed to moderate context exchange. So that's for the first challenge. And then the second one I want to highlight is what I would like to call the commodification of public infrastructures. So what is also called the platformization of infrastructure. So we can see the platform companies are increasingly starting to fulfill infrastructural roles. Classic example, search engines provide gateway to the world's information. Social networks provide public identity, and effectively more and more so also an online passport. Or what to think about mapping services that help us navigate the world around us. So platforms are now clearly infrastructural in the information sphere, but are becoming more infrastructural also in other spheres, like transport or healthcare or education, to name a few. So that's problematic because platform businesses are, as you know, revolving around data-driven personalized advertising and services, which revolve around commercial models rather than public values such as equality, transparency, trust, and privacy. So those are, there are more challenges, but obviously these are two of the core ones. So engaging with these challenges, I think there are huge opportunities for Europe, and I especially want to hear, of course, from you how you think about this. So thinking about the first one in terms of gaining access to data relevant to society and insights into data infrastructures and algorithmic systems developed by these major corporations, that's obviously something that we need to work towards. But that's, of course, also not in any way a straightforward process. So providing access to platform data and insight into algorithmic systems immediately raises a range of privacy concerns, as well as economic and political democratic concerns, as well, the Cambridge Analytica scandal painfully demonstrated. So the challenge is really to develop a public insight and oversight without opening up platform activity to further manipulation. So policy and legislative measures need to be informed by research, but then the question is, so what type of research do we need? And second, to close, in the light of the commodification of infrastructures, it's, I think, high time to rethink public infrastructures and public service and what that would entail. And again, that's not a straightforward matter. So think, for example, about public service broadcasting as an example. So it's very much the question whether public broadcasters, and that's a discussion we've been having in the Netherlands, should continue to produce and distribute the full range of programs they have produced in the broadcast era. Or maybe they should focus on providing high-quality news and fact-checking. But then the question comes up, is public service still, in that scenario, able to sustain national communities and traditions? Or what to think about identification. So it seems to make sense that also in an online context, you would have to have public online identification systems. But so what would that entail in a global or even European context? That's probably going to be very, very difficult. So in other words, again, scholarly research would be needed to really think about what type of public infrastructures are required in a platform environment. So, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think you've raised a lot of very pressing questions. Maybe we don't have the answers to it, but if we could get some feedback, what you think into what direction should or what areas of research should we foster in order to tackle these problems? Yes, please.
Hello, good morning. Kimberly Kusen-Niebe, German Aerospace Agency, a National Contact Point Society. I guess my response actually goes to both Heather and to Thomas. because I think it's a bit interconnected. And in particular, I'm thinking a lot about the complexity of the questions that we're faced with and how we're thinking about how to approach them. And one thing that comes to my mind quite often is that the people most affected, so when we talk about civil society, just everyone, I think a lot of people on the ground who are not experts, they ask really good questions, but they're very simple questions. And they often also indicate through their questioning, I think, what we need to be taken into consideration. So I think in part, it's about really listening to what people are saying and asking maybe in simple forms, and then in some way integrating that into the way that we think about these complex questions. So I think it has to do a lot with integrating just these concerns that people are voicing about, like you were saying, Thomas, these platforms, and the idea that, yes, we live in a world right now where the situation is that we are increasingly digitized, and that knowledge economy is really in the supremacy, but not everyone necessarily understands that or sees it that way. So it might be about bringing in those other views and seeing how can we use them as a way of better understanding what we take for granted as being the norm. And then from there, trying to understand how can we improve the situation.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Jan Pomorski from the Guild. I just wanted to connect to a couple of the last points you made, Heather, and I just wanted to link this to a session that we heard on the first day of the RNI days on the innovation principle. And it seems to me, so the fundamental debate there was, how much of the precautionary element do we need and so forth. And it seems to me that what you've alluded to is that we need, in fact, far more than just the precautionary principle in this, that actually, especially when you think about regulation, how that works. I mean, that's just even one step further removed from where the citizens are, because it's implemented through the national polity, so that actually, therefore, the question of how you create a citizen's contract around the kinds of things the EU does, it seems to me then would be absolutely central. And I just ask you to reflect a little bit on how that could be done and how we find how we do this. And then the second question is really around this question of, it's a related question, but more focusing on the science. So, citizens' involvement is obviously a huge issue now, also for Horizon Europe. And my concern is that there's a sort of danger that it's so tempting to think about, let's just have a few citizens' assemblies and then we'll have the legitimacy for the research that we need. And it seems to me what you suggested actually goes much deeper than that, so that we really need to think about how things work, how citizens are involved in very different ways. And again, if we take those questions seriously, then it's almost as though the whole question of SSH integration in Horizon Europe goes away, because we need to really embed these really complex issues in all of what we do, whether it's the missions or whether it's actually some of the other challenge-led questions.
Thank you very much. Jorgos, on your right.
Yeah, Henning vom Stein from O-Ton European Public Affairs. I'm working with the Hans Böckler Foundation in Germany on the issue on workers' voice, and that is the point you brought in, bringing in the other views. I think platforms who are already organized in the classical world, like workers, for example, representatives also, in that whatever decision-making towards a transition in the digital or in the sustainability issues we have in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Maria from the Swedish Research Council again. I would like to pick up on the comment from the Guild and also what Heather said before, because I think we already have, we need climate scientists and social scientists to come up with evidence, and we need more evidence. But there is also the present program in Horizon 2020, Science with and for Society, where evidence is being created on exactly this. But there is no place for that program in Horizon Europe. So, and it's supposed to be mainstream. So I would just, I mean, there are all kinds of projects on genome editing and public dialogues and how do you really engage with citizens, responsible research and innovation, etc. So my concern is that this is supposed to be mainstreamed, but I'm not sure that time is ripe, perhaps, to do that. So just point to the Commission, just make sure that you don't forget what is already being done and that kind of competence. That's also, I mean, a research field in itself. So they have to be on board.
Yeah. Maybe I just reply to this one because to avoid misunderstandings and to take on board your concerns. The mainstreaming has some good and some bad. On the one hand, it raises awareness. On the other hand, there is the risk that it's a box-ticking exercise, and by this you forget about the rest. What has happened increasingly now in our work programs is that in the individual clusters, we also have topics which deal exactly with this part, how to get the citizen into it. You are right in saying that there might be a risk that the time is not fully ripe for that. I take this on board. I haven't got the solution for it, but we will see how to tackle this best. But at least there are already some examples where it works. If it's sufficient, I can't tell you. Yes, please.
Nick Brunsveld again from the University of Amsterdam. Maybe, Thomas, your questions are, would it also be helpful to see if there's examples in the past of similar, like we have with the transition from after communism? And can you think of examples that would help us to grasp your questions more fully and think about possible ways of solving them?
Yes, please.
Beata Zwierzyńska from Eurodoc and also originally from Poland. The transition comments from communism really ring a bell. And I come from a background in pedagogy and historical case study on roundtable and the communist transition, particularly on education, plus digital space, action research and ethnography. Sorry. So I just want to bring up this issue of when we talk about education, which is like repeated all over in the rooms, or I don't know, maybe I hear it all the time. But for me, education is actually teachers. Teachers are the key, and like Horizon and educating teachers, I cannot see a lot of that. And my second comment is connected to NGOs. Like we see a lot of involvement and partnerships with business, etc. But when democracy and we talk about values, like I cannot see enough in the Horizon of the like collaborations with NGOs and like on the university level. And like yesterday there was this session and there was collaboration with civil society, like individuals, but not like a structural solution for, like we talk all the time about business collaboration, companies, and where are the NGOs? Like if we want to educate civil society, like, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yorgos? Thank you. Yes, please. Here.
Hi. Thinking about it from a commission perspective, I'm finding it quite hard to see how you take these points and construct a program around democracy out of them.
Will not be possible.
So whether it's helpful, maybe it's not. But are there not three levels that are being discussed here? There's one about the infrastructure for democracy, which is the things that we're talking about when it comes to, building up this kind of research base, AI, and so on and so forth. There's one which is democracy in practice, which is around the sort of social science elements of what is happening in these different places and how can you make some of these things work. And then the third is a kind of experimenting on yourself, which is rather sort of Victorian way of working, where the Commission itself is using the Horizon Europe programme and its wider work as a way of testing some of these democratic methods and how to build them out. Because it feels like we're talking about societal involvement, and I think mainstreaming is a real challenge, because like mainstreaming, as everyone who's worked in a civil service organisation knows, often means like mass forgetting by taking a team that was doing it and making it everyone's 9th priority. So for me, it feels like if you can put this experimentation in the system by putting it into the development of the strategic plan, then you've killed two birds with one stone.
Yeah. Now I'm abusing my role as a moderator and give you a direct response. So firstly, thanks very much for this structure. I think it is very useful. The second thing is that the mainstreaming as we practice it now, in my view, we have arrived at its limits. We can still fine-tune a little bit, but this is how far we can go. And we now must go deeper, because in the end, what we want to do is to achieve a behavioral change. And through this, we must go deeper to see what the impact is and things like that. And this is what we're going to try to develop. Hopefully, the time is ripe for it now, and also the mindset of the people concerned. Now, before concluding our session, I would now invite our 3 speakers for a final statement. And let me start with Matthias. And I should also thank you very much for having made the point of the social sciences involved into all the clusters. And I share your view that the other clusters are now much more aware of the need for behavioral change and the role of social sciences. I'm not so sure if our sector in itself is sufficiently ready to take up this challenge. So I think this will be one of our big challenges for the future. But Matthias, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I think big parts of the sector are ready. You have to communicate to them in the right way. You have to explicitly invite them. When I think back about our Austrian presidency conference last year, at more or less the same time, we had big discussions about how social sciences and humanities can have an impact. And I remember a study among all the Swedish innovation agencies, Vinnova and Forte, which looked at how to communicate programs. And one very simple outcome was, if you have an open interdisciplinary program, but the posters that communicate it, that advertise it, are with people in white lab suits or lab clothing, then really social sciences and humanities will not read the small texts that will say all disciplines are addressed. So sometimes it's these very simple things, but this, I think, has a general meaning for the program. One observation I made was that we talked a lot about communicating, and I think one important thing is also to communicate methodology, because social sciences and humanities research outcomes often face the challenges, especially in public debates, that the results are confused with everyday observations, with opinion, even with ideology. And I think it really has to be communicated more openly and more structured, how you came to these results and why they are different and why are they evidence-based. And I think this is a challenge for many of the research projects in our field. The colleague from Poland said that education was raised all over the panels, and I made a very similar observation. And I think it's, with this regard, it's really a good opportunity that the new commissioner will combine the portfolios of research and education. And I think we should actively look for synergies with the education director general and Juhard. You are the perfect person for this with your background from DG EAC. And for instance, our ministry is also combining these two fields. So I think also in the member states, there are a lot of opportunities in this regard. Yeah, that the Science Within For Society program is not continued in this way is a real pity, because many of the issues raised today go directly in that direction, and we could very well end up in our cluster as a sort of security net for research questions like this. maybe it's good, but it would be even better if this would be funded more widely across the future program. And with this, I just want to say that I think you should all use the online consultation and not only make your remarks about the future cluster 2, but in that spirit to all clusters across the program. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather, please.
Thanks. I just want to end with one point that really crosses over from what Thomas said with what I said. I mean, he raised this issue of rethinking public infrastructure and public broadcasters in a platform environment. This is absolutely vital to getting the climate politics right. At the moment, we're in a really quite benign political environment for good climate and well thought out climate action and a fair transition in Europe, with a very high level of public support, strong civil society mobilization for action, and a lot of politicians and parties moving in that direction. The climate politics are going to turn really nasty really quickly, and the discrediting of evidence and research on science will be a big part of that. Already there's funding going to populist radical right parties in Europe from the US climate denial movement to do the same thing here. Look at what's happening with Alternative für Deutschland, who are already campaigning on this basis. Other populist parties will follow very quickly because migration is no longer getting them the votes that it used to. And once you have got in the public mind the idea that the science is not unreliable, I mean, look at what's happened in the US, and that there's alternative facts out there about the basics of the climate science, then you've lost the game. So let's learn the lessons of the anti-vax movement, which was in many respects a civil society movement. Okay, I think there weren't big corporate interests behind it, but how far and how fast it moved, and the way that government and media were really caught on the hop, and it spread through social media without really public broadcasters coming back in to correct what it was in the end a massive public health issue. So if we allow that to happen on climate, then we are all doomed. We really are. So sorry to end on a rather gloomy note, but the science is at the heart of gaining and maintaining democratic consent. And so we must protect that, and that means paying a lot of attention to how it's presented.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me also end on a sort of gloomy note, or at least we are. So it seems to me when we think about infrastructures, and we did have and we have known platforms in the past, what we're confronted with today on an infrastructural level is, I think, something quite new, in the sense that we're seeing huge corporations moving into infrastructural positions. And that creates all sorts of problems in terms of monopolization of public resources, etc., which I think needs to be met with a public response. So that would be on the one hand. On the other hand, I think what we're also faced with are more demands on citizens, right? And you've talked about this, and I think the same applies to the kind of issues I've tried to raise, is that what is required from citizens is now much more of a critical assessment of the types of information, opinions they're confronted with, because we no longer have the infrastructure in place that checks the accountability of the information that is circulated. So I would say it's both on the infrastructure level and on the citizen level that we're really confronted with big challenges. So thanks very much for all the input.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Now, before concluding, a commercial on our own behalf. You might have seen here on the chairs our policy review on democracy. I think we've still got a few spare copies. This has been written by Wolfgang Merkel, who unfortunately was not able to make it to our session. I can highly recommend reading this review to you. This co-creation does not end with our session now. You've still got the opportunity, as Matthias mentioned, to put forward your opinions, your suggestions in the open consultation until the 4th of October. And we've still got in the village part on the ground floor a booth number 10 on cluster 2. We are still there and can welcome you if you've got comments, ideas we should take up. We're happy to receive you there and have a talk with you. I would like to thank our speakers for their inspiring statements they have made, and I should thank all of you for the very constructive points you have made, and it will really help us in designing a meaningful and useful work program for the next years to come. Very many thanks.